Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt as we work through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We are now starting from Paumanok, section number 3. Now my assumption is that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, find our list that says Talks with Walt. And my hope is that you have followed all of our previous 24 lectures over the 24 poems of inscriptions, and that as well you were looking at the introductory lecture for starting from Paumanok, and I've already worked with sections 1 and 2 as we now turn to section 3. Let's go now to the reading of section 3. It is brief, but so many important ideas are going to be resurrected here. He will begin with the same word that he uses in section 2, Americanos, and then we'll continue. Pay attention at 2b to all of the exclamation points. We're going to see 5 of them here starting this poem out. Americanos conquers, marches humanitarian foremost, century marches, libertad masses. For you, a program of chants. Chants of the prairies, chants of the long-running Mississippi and down to the Mexican Sea, chants of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, chants going forth from the center, from Kansas and thence, equidistant, shooting in pulses of fire, ceaseless, to vivify all. Now, the very first thing, again, I want to point out, 5, 6 at least of these exclamation points, and let's just point out, every time that he uses this word chants as this anaphoria, as we've talked about, this beginning of the same line, theoretically, all of those could as well be ended with some kind of exclamation point. This is, like so much of Leaves of Grass, Whitman's celebration of America. And of course, notice he doesn't use the word America very often in Leaves of Grass. Here it is Americanos. We talked about that in our section number 2 discussion. I Hear America Singing is one of the only times that the actual word America gets used in the Inscriptions 24 poems. Let's go through this now. Notice he begins with Americanos and then the exclamation points. Notice he emphasizes the conqueror element of the American history. He isn't going to run from this at all. And of course, in his famous poem about Christopher Columbus, he will do something quite similar. Now, of course, as we have said, we are the stories we accept and we are the stories that we tell and retell. We're the stories we accept and reject. And of course, some of the history of America will be for Whitman problematic, no question. And yet here, he's going to celebrate the conquering of what? Well, that's an interesting question. What is it that was conquered? Often for Whitman, it isn't peoples, it's lands. However, we're familiar with the symbiotic nature of those two things. Here in a bit, it'll be the prairies, of course, right? Conquerors, marches humanitarian. Now that's fascinating. In the same way that we're conquerors, we're also humanitarian. Now, of course, we find this idea in Virgil and especially in the Aeneid, the idea that it is Roman law that will standardize so much of this civilized world by virtue of its law and language and all of that. Go back to our lectures at learnstrong.net over each of the books of the Aeneid to kind of recapture some of that. Notice the word foremost. This is that exceptionalism that Whitman's always playing with as he talks about America. Century marches, that idea that we will march into the future. And then, of course, libertad. Now, he loves to use this Spanish rendering of liberty or freedom, often in Leaves of Grass. We'll be paying attention to it. And then the word masses. Notice that often these, after the exclamation point, the next word isn't capitalized, and masses is not capitalized. This notion of en masse is one that we're going to see over and over again as well. Collective. We're all kind of in this project together. And then finally for you, and now here we are still. This is almost like inscriptions. This celebration, this invitation to say, what I've done in Leaves of Grass is not for myself, it's for you. For you, and then he calls it a program, notice the spelling, right? Program of chants. Now, this intentionality is huge when he uses the word program. In other words, I've got a plan here, and I want you to understand from the very beginning, so much of Leaves of Grass is about that expression of the plan, but it's really a song, it's a chant, and so here we are. And as we've said before, and we're going to hear this again and again, every time he uses the word chants, C-H-A-N-T-S, it does sound very much, for an oral reading of the poem, like you're saying C-H-A-N-C-E, chance, right? Give me a chance. And so I think Whitman is acutely aware of this. The anaphoria, of course, of now the four, one right after another chants. Notice all Midwestern references. Chants of the prairies, the long-running Mississippi, down to the Mexican Sea, chants of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and then when you get Kansas in the next line, those are the 7 states that will constitute as the Middle West of the Midwest, right? Chants going forth from the, notice the spelling of center, from Kansas, and thence equidistance. He sees Kansas as the heart in many ways of America, and that every place from Kansas on will somehow be equally distant. Now, what is it that makes all of these significant? Well, obviously, it's the heart of the growing country of America, especially, of course, grain country, we might say, right? Shooting is an interesting word here. That's the war language we're going to see over and over again. My book, And the War Won, he will say, right, in one of the inscriptions passages. Shooting in pulses of fire. Now, this pulses, we've said, this urging, this pulsing is central. Fire is a key symbol of Leaves of Grass, so we're going to constantly make attention to it. Obviously, we think of the phoenix and the phoenix bird and the resurrection out of fire. The word ceaseless is as well always central to Whitman as pedagogue. It's all about lifelong learning. It's all about going forward, the procreant urge, as he will often refer to it. Now, what is all of that about? And all of these chants that are shooting in pulses of fire ceaselessly. Well, they are now the last 3 words of this poem: to vivify, to bring to life, to create all. Now, this inclusivity of the word all. Here, what do we mean? All states, obviously, right? In other words, we're going to prove, we're going to test the value of all of the United States through Leaves of Grass. Wow. Well, I mean, again, unbelievably ambitious as what we said about Milton at the beginning of Paradise Lost. Things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme to justify the ways of God to men. And I think we can say that Whitman wrote, in large measure, he did write Leaves of Grass and publish it finally in its deathbed edition as a theodicy, as an explanation for all of the evil and pain caused by America and Americans. Somehow there is some important meaning to it all, and I think this is central to how we will in fact read Leaves of Grass. Let's finish quickly now at 2a. Well, obviously America is worthy of chants. At 2b, we talked about the exclamation points, the repetition of 5 or 6 at least chants. Notice the listing here. That's so important to our reading of Leaves of Grass. At 3a, I just want to mention 3 authors that we've not really paid much attention to in our lectures up to this point, but we obviously need to. The first is the great Carl Sandberg. Of course, most famously, his poem about Chicago and the idea of the Midwest and how significant it is. One of the great singers of America following in the tradition of Whitman. Allen Ginsberg and his classic Howl, I think, is in large measure going to be born of a close study of Leaves of Grass. But I think starting from Paumanok, I think these lines influenced very much Ginsberg's work. And then finally, I want to mention here Woody Guthrie as such an important singer of American thought, especially in the 1930s. This land is your land, this land is my land. And then, of course, he begins to talk geography. Finally, at 3b, do you think America worth chanting about? Do you believe America and the American tradition is in fact one of singing? And then secondly, how do you balance the 2 parts of America, the conqueror and the humanitarian? Because both elements are obviously there. Come back and we'll be ready then for part 4, stanza 4 of Starting from Paumanok. Thank you.